Feudal Japan, an era that spanned roughly from the 12th to the 19th century, was a time of profound societal, economic, and political transformation. While many associate Japan with its beautiful temples, refined art, and breathtaking landscapes, there's a darker, much more brutal side to its history that often gets overshadowed. Life during this period was harsh, dangerous, and filled with challenges that tested the very resilience of the people who lived through it. The feudal system in Japan was heavily influenced by the samurai, the warrior class, who were not just soldiers but the elite ruling group. They held great power over the peasantry, often dictating every aspect of their lives. The peasant class, which formed the bulk of the population, was tasked with working the land to sustain the economy, but their lives were marred by constant struggle, exploitation, and fear. Life for peasants was dominated by one thing: survival. Agriculture was the backbone of society, and with the constant threat of famine, the peasants had to deal with a delicate balance of producing enough food to feed the population while avoiding the heavy taxes imposed on them by their samurai overlords. If they failed to meet the quota, punishments could be swift and severe. These punishments included everything from having their land confiscated to being publicly flogged or worse, executed. The samurai were the enforcers of the law, and they had the authority to carry out these brutal acts without much recourse. In addition to the threat of violence from their samurai overlords, peasants also had to contend with the brutal elements of nature. Earthquakes, typhoons, and droughts were frequent in Japan, and their lives were often upended by these unpredictable disasters. The lack of modern technology meant that natural calamities could wipe out entire villages, leaving people without food, shelter, or any means of survival. The samurai, who lived by a strict code of honor known as Bushido, were also often involved in violent conflicts. These conflicts, known as the Warring States period, were marked by constant fighting between samurai clans, each vying for power. During these wars, it wasn't just the samurai who fought. Everyone, from farmers to craftsmen, was forced to fight or face certain death. The period was filled with bloody battles, sieges, and massacres. It was a world where violence was seen as a natural part of life. One of the most disturbing aspects of feudal Japan was the practice of seppuku, or ritual suicide. This was a way for samurai to restore their honor if they had been defeated in battle or had committed a grave dishonor. They would take their own lives in a highly ritualized manner, often in the presence of witnesses. This practice was not seen as a weakness, but rather as a way of maintaining dignity in the face of failure. It was a practice that also struck fear into the hearts of peasants and common folk, who knew that the samurai were a class of people who would go to any lengths to preserve their honor. For the common people, the brutality of feudal Japan was not confined to warfare or natural disasters. It was woven into the very fabric of their existence. The social hierarchy was rigid, and the samurai were at the top, with peasants, artisans, and merchants beneath them. While the samurai enjoyed wealth and power, the lower classes lived in constant poverty. The merchant class, despite its growing influence, was still looked down upon, and the artisans were often seen as nothing more than tools for the samurai's desires. Peasants lived in small, cramped villages, often surrounded by high, thick walls. To protect themselves from both bandits and rival samurai, they worked long hours in the fields, planting and harvesting crops under the watchful eyes of their lords. If they were lucky, they could keep a small portion of the crops for themselves, but the majority went to the samurai as taxes. There was little room for personal freedom, as even the most basic of decisions, like how to spend their earnings or what to do with their time, was dictated by the oppressive system that kept them subjugated. The women of feudal Japan had it equally, if not more, difficult. They were often seen as property of their fathers or husbands and had little control over their own lives. Marriages were arranged, and women were expected to serve their husbands and bear children, particularly sons. In the event of a husband's death, a woman's fate was often sealed by her ability to remarry. Widowhood was considered a shameful condition for a woman, and those who found themselves widowed were often left to fend for themselves in a world that valued them only as wives and mothers. As we delve deeper into the everyday life of feudal Japan, the environment surrounding the samurai's strict hierarchy becomes even more evident. The feudal system was not just a political structure, it was a worldview, one that shaped every aspect of society. From the noble samurai to the lowest peasant, everyone had a defined role, and stepping out of line could bring swift punishment. The samurai were not only warriors, but also landowners, and their power extended far beyond the battlefield. They controlled vast estates, and their power was deeply tied to the land they held. The peasants, whose lives were entirely dependent on farming, worked these estates, providing the samurai with food, resources, and wealth. The samurai's sense of entitlement was so strong that they viewed their control over the peasants as their right. In fact, samurai often took drastic measures to protect their land and wealth. This could include anything from using excessive force to put down uprisings, to simply driving the peasantry into poverty by overtaxing them. The concept of daimyo, the powerful feudal lords who ruled over large regions of Japan, further fueled this culture of oppression. A daimyo was often a samurai warlord who controlled entire domains, which were subdivided into smaller territories called han. These han were governed by lesser samurai or retainers who enforced the daimyo's will, often ruthlessly. If a peasant found themselves caught in the crossfire of these power struggles, there was little hope for them to escape unscathed. The daimyo were constantly engaged in political maneuvering and military conflict with each other. Alliances were forged and broken at a moment's notice. One day a daimyo might ally themselves with a neighboring lord, but the next day they might be at war with them. This constant turmoil created an environment where the lives of the common people were in constant danger. Civil wars and battles were common, and villages often found themselves caught in the middle, subjected to pillaging and destruction. The constant state of unrest made it impossible for any sense of stability to take root. Life for peasants during these times was not only dangerous because of external threats, but also due to internal struggles. Villages were frequently forced to give up their food stores, livestock, and even their homes to support the samurai and their families. There were no social safety nets, no welfare system to fall back on. If a peasant couldn't pay the taxes demanded by their samurai lords, they risked being thrown into prison or worse, executed. Desperation often led to violent uprisings, but even these were met with harsh retribution. Rebellions were ruthlessly crushed, and those who dared to challenge the system were often punished with extreme brutality. One of the most well-known uprisings in feudal Japan was the Jokyu Rebellion of 1221, which was a direct challenge to the imperial court and the shogunate, the military government led by the samurai. The rebellion was sparked by the power struggle between the court and the military government, but it was crushed within months. Tens of thousands of rebels were killed, and the repercussions were felt throughout Japan for generations. For the peasants who were caught in the middle of this conflict, it meant even greater oppression, as the shogunate sought to tighten its control over the country. While samurai warriors were bound by the strict code of Bushido, which emphasized loyalty, courage, and honor, Their lives were not free from brutality and violence. Samurai, despite their lofty ideals, were often called upon to commit terrible acts of war and to shed blood in the name of their lords. This code demanded that they demonstrate honor and courage in the face of their enemies, but it also held them to impossible standards, leaving little room for weakness. The expectations were so high that many samurai would end their lives rather than live in shame. The practice of seppuku, ritual suicide, was not only a means of preserving personal honor, but was often seen as a way to avoid the shame of defeat or failure. For samurai, death by their own hand was preferable to the dishonor of being captured or losing a battle. This cultural norm created a society where death was a constant companion to those in power, and it reinforced the harshness and brutality of the times. For the lower classes, the threat of violence was always present. Peasants, artisans, and merchants had little to no voice in society. They were subject to the whims of the samurai and the daimyo, who controlled their lands and resources. The social mobility that is taken for granted in modern times simply did not exist in feudal Japan. There was no way to rise above your station, no way to escape the brutal cycle of poverty and oppression. Those born into the lower classes remained there, often for their entire lives, trapped in a cycle of servitude and subjugation. The harsh realities of life during this period were made even worse by the oppressive social structures and rigid class divisions. Despite their hardships, the peasants had little recourse for escape. Revolts were crushed swiftly, and those who tried to flee their villages or refused to pay taxes were hunted down. The vast majority of people had no choice but to continue working the land, living under the oppressive rule of their samurai masters. As we venture deeper into the brutal and dangerous world of feudal Japan, it becomes clear that the societal structure itself was a key factor in perpetuating the suffering of the lower classes. While the samurai class upheld their image as the epitome of honor, bravery, and virtue, the reality for most of the population was far from glamorous. Life for the common people was a never-ending struggle against oppression, famine, and the whims of their rulers. One of the most oppressive aspects of feudal society was the land distribution system. The land was divided into large estates controlled by the daimyo and samurai, and peasants were forced to work these lands in order to produce food and resources. However, the peasants were not allowed to own the land they worked on. They were merely tenants, subject to the will of their lords. The daimyo would impose taxes on the peasants, often taking the majority of the crops they grew. This system of taxation, coupled with the samurai's demands for tribute and the constant threat of famine, created a cycle of poverty that was almost impossible to escape. In many cases, the peasants would have to pay a significant portion of their harvest to the samurai, leaving them with barely enough to feed their families. If the harvest was poor due to bad weather, pests, or natural disasters, the peasants would be forced to pay the same high taxes, even if they had nothing to give. This led to a constant state of fear and anxiety, as the peasants never knew if they would have enough food to survive the winter, or if they would be punished for failing to meet their quotas. The burden of taxation was not just financial, it was also physical. The samurai, who were tasked with enforcing the daimyo's will, often resorted to brutal tactics to ensure that taxes were collected. If a peasant could not pay their dues, they would face violent retribution. The samurai would use force to extract taxes from the peasants, sometimes resorting to physical punishment or even execution. This created an atmosphere of constant fear, where the peasants lived in a state of perpetual tension, knowing that even the slightest misstep could lead to their demise. In addition to the financial and physical burdens, the peasants were also subjected to the samurai's social control. The samurai enforced a strict moral code that dictated every aspect of life in feudal Japan. The code of Bushido, which the samurai adhered to, was based on the principles of loyalty, honor, and self-discipline. While these ideals were noble in theory, they were often wielded as tools of oppression. For example, the samurai expected absolute loyalty from their subordinates, and any act of disobedience or defiance could result in severe punishment. The peasants had no choice but to conform to the samurai's expectations, as any attempt to challenge the system was met with swift retribution. The samurai's sense of duty and honor also led them to be involved in constant warfare. While the samurai were often seen as protectors of the people, the reality was that they were also responsible for many of the conflicts that ravaged the country. The Warring States period, which lasted from the 15th to the 17th centuries, was marked by a series of brutal civil wars between samurai clans. These wars were fought over land, power, and resources, and they often resulted in massive loss of life. Villages were raided, crops were destroyed, and entire communities were displaced. The wars of feudal Japan were not just fought on the battlefield, they were fought in the hearts and minds of the people. The samurai, with their code of honor and loyalty, were trained to view war as a natural and even noble endeavor. However, for the peasants, the constant state of conflict meant that their lives were always in danger. They lived in fear of samurai raids, where villages would be plundered, homes burned, and families torn apart. This created an environment where survival was a daily battle, and for many, death was a far more likely outcome than a prosperous life. The constant threat of war also led to the widespread use of conscription. Samurai would often force peasants to fight in their wars, even though they had no military training or desire to be involved in the conflict. Peasants were often drafted into battle under duress, with little regard for their safety or well-being. This further deepened the resentment between the samurai and the peasant class, as many peasants were forced to die in wars that they had no stake in. Beyond the physical toll of constant warfare and taxation, the peasants were also subjected to psychological oppression. The rigid social hierarchy of feudal Japan created a sense of hopelessness for those at the bottom. The samurai, who lived in luxury, saw themselves as above the peasants and treated them with disdain. The peasants, on the other hand, had little to no opportunity for social mobility. The vast majority of them were born into their station in life, and their fate was sealed from the moment they were born. It was a system that perpetuated inequality, where the rich and powerful thrived at the expense of the poor and powerless, the Zeis. Psychological toll of this system was immense. Peasants lived in constant fear, knowing that they could be punished, exploited, or even killed at any moment. There was little to no hope for the future, as the cycle of poverty and oppression seemed endless. For many, life was a slow, grinding struggle to survive, with no chance of escape. The psychological trauma caused by the constant threat of violence, poverty, and hopelessness left deep scars on the people of feudal Japan. Scars that would last long after the feudal system itself had crumbled. As we continue exploring the brutal realities of life in feudal Japan, we see how the pervasive fear, violence, and rigid hierarchy extended beyond the battlefield and into the daily lives of the people. The samurai's role as both warriors and landlords meant that their power was all-encompassing, and for the lower classes, there was little escape from their oppression. The social system was designed to keep everyone in their place, ensuring that the samurai remained at the top and the peasants stayed at the bottom. This deeply entrenched inequality permeated every aspect of life and made any form of resistance seem almost impossible. One of the most dehumanizing aspects of feudal Japan was the way in which the samurai used punishment and fear as tools of control. While the Bushido code emphasized honor and discipline for the samurai, the lower classes were subjected to horrific treatment. The samurai, in their pursuit of maintaining order and loyalty, would frequently use violence to keep the peasants and commoners in line. Public executions, torture, and corporal punishment were regular features of life under the samurai's watch, and these acts served as stark reminders of the consequences of disobedience. One particularly brutal form of punishment was the use of torture chambers, where those accused of crimes would be subjected to unimaginable pain and suffering. These torture methods were designed not only to extract confessions, but to publicly humiliate and break the spirit of the accused. The samurai believed that a person's honor could be stripped away through physical pain, and as a result, they would subject their prisoners to gruesome and prolonged methods of torture. These chambers were often located in public squares, where the suffering of the accused could be witnessed by others. This practice served as both a deterrent and a reminder of the consequences of defying the samurai. For the peasants, the fear of punishment was ever present. The samurai wielded their power with little regard for the lives of the common people, and any perceived slight or failure to meet expectations could result in severe consequences. For example, peasants who were caught stealing food to feed their families could be executed or severely punished, even if they had no other option but to steal in order to survive. This created an environment where the fear of punishment loomed large, and people lived in constant anxiety, unsure of when their next misstep might result in death. Even worse, the lives of the lower classes were controlled not only through fear of violence, but through the systematic stripping of their personal freedoms. The samurai and daimyo held absolute power over their subjects, and even basic rights such as movement and association were severely restricted. The peasants were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without permission from their lords. The concept of serfdom in feudal Japan meant that the peasants were tied to their land, and their very existence was tied to the whims of the samurai who owned the land. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving, with no room for upward mobility. The samurai viewed themselves as the elite, and the peasants were seen as expendable tools to be used for their own benefit. The artisans and merchants, while slightly above the peasants in terms of social status, were still considered inferior to the samurai. They were at the mercy of the samurai and daimyo, who would often seize their goods and resources to further their own agendas. Despite the growth of a merchant class in Japan during the later stages of the feudal period, the samurai continued to view merchants with contempt, seeing them as selfish profiteers who lacked honor and discipline. The harshness of this system was compounded by the constant threat of war and violence. Even though feudal Japan saw long periods of relative peace, there were constant undercurrents of tension that kept the population on edge. The samurai class was always prepared for battle, and their lives were shaped by a constant state of readiness. Warfare was not just a military endeavor, but a way of life for the samurai. The Code of Bushido demanded that samurai remain in peak physical condition and ready to fight at a moment's notice. This constant state of preparation, combined with the brutal nature of samurai combat, made life in feudal Japan even more dangerous. For the peasants and lower classes, this meant that their lives were not only shaped by the demands of their lords, but also by the ever-present specter of war. Villages could be attacked at any time by rival samurai clans or even bandits, and the common people were often caught in the crossfire. The peasants were forced to defend their homes and families, sometimes with no more than basic tools like farming implements or makeshift weapons. These wars were not confined to distant battlefields, but could erupt in any village or town, turning everyday life into a fight for survival. The brutality of feudal Japan also extended to the treatment of women. While women in other parts of the world during the same period were often relegated to domestic roles, the women of feudal Japan faced an even more rigid and oppressive set of expectations. Women, particularly those of the samurai class, were expected to uphold the honor of their families by adhering to strict codes of conduct. Any breach of these codes, such as an affair or a failure to meet the high expectations of their role, could result in disgrace for the entire family. This often led to women being subjected to punishment or even death, as their actions were seen as a reflection of their family's honor. For peasant women, life was even harder. They had little say in the direction of their lives, as marriages were often arranged by their families, and their primary role was to bear children and serve their husbands. The concept of patriarchy was deeply ingrained in feudal Japan, and the women were largely seen as inferior to men. They were not only expected to maintain their household, but also to work alongside their husbands in the fields, contributing to the harsh labor that defined peasant life. Despite this, women were often excluded from any kind of formal power or influence, and their lives were bound by the same rigid social structures that controlled the men of their families. As we continue to uncover the brutal realities of life in feudal Japan, it becomes clear that even the most mundane aspects of daily life were dominated by fear, violence, and a rigid societal structure that left little room for personal freedom or autonomy. For the peasants, artisans, and merchants, every aspect of their existence was defined by their position within the strict hierarchy of feudal Japan. The samurai held almost absolute power, and their authority extended far beyond military matters. It seeped into the social, economic, and even spiritual lives of the people. One particularly insidious aspect of the feudal system was the idea of mutual obligation, or giri, which was the cultural expectation that individuals would act in the best interest of their social superiors and inferiors. This concept was rooted in the Confucian ideals of loyalty and filial piety, and it permeated every level of society. The samurai were obligated to protect their vassals, and in return the peasants and lower classes were expected to remain loyal to their samurai masters. However, the reality of this system was far more exploitative than idealistic. For the peasants, giri meant that they were bound to serve their samurai lords and repay them for their protection that, more often than not, came at a great cost. In exchange for their loyalty, the samurai would often demand a portion of the peasants' crops, livestock, and labor, leaving the peasants with little for themselves. The relationship between the samurai and the peasantry was one of parasitism, where the samurai extracted resources from the peasants to maintain their luxurious lifestyles. The peasants had little choice but to comply, as any resistance was met with harsh punishment. This system of mutual obligation was not just a one-way street, it also served to reinforce the power dynamics within feudal society. The samurai were expected to uphold their code of honor, but this was a privilege that was not extended to the lower classes. The samurai could act with impunity, and their actions were often justified by their status as the ruling class. In contrast, peasants, artisans, and merchants were bound by a different set of rules that were often arbitrary, brutal, and unforgiving. One of the most devastating aspects of this system was the way in which it perpetuated a cycle of poverty and exploitation. The peasants were not only burdened by taxes and labor obligations, but also by the constant threat of famine, disease, and natural disaster. Even in times of relative peace, the peasants faced the harsh reality of having to work long hours in the fields, often under the watchful eye of the samurai or their retainers. The work was grueling and the rewards were few. The samurai would often demand that the peasants work longer hours or produce more food, regardless of the conditions or weather. If the peasants failed to meet these demands, they were punished severely. Natural disasters such as floods, droughts, and earthquakes were a constant threat in feudal Japan, and they added another layer of suffering to the already harsh lives of the peasants. When a natural disaster struck, the peasants' livelihoods were destroyed, and they were forced to rely on their samurai lords for help. However, the samurai often did not offer assistance willingly. If the peasants were unable to pay taxes or produce enough food after a disaster, they were often punished or forced to leave their homes. The samurai, who lived in relative luxury, had little sympathy for the suffering of the common people. The idea that peasants should be grateful for the protection of the samurai, even when their lives were being destroyed, was deeply ingrained in the culture of feudal Japan. In addition to the physical toll of poverty and hard labor, the peasants also had to contend with the constant psychological pressure of living under a system that treated them as little more than property. The lack of social mobility meant that they had little hope of ever escaping their station in life. If you were born a peasant, you were likely to die as one. This social rigidity led to a sense of hopelessness that pervaded every aspect of peasant life. The idea of rising above your social class or changing your fate was nearly impossible. Even the most skilled artisans or merchants were still at the mercy of the samurai, who could take their goods, their land, or even their lives at any time. The psychological toll on the peasants was immense. Living in constant fear of punishment, famine, and disaster created a culture of compliance and resignation. The peasants had little agency over their lives, and the fear of retribution kept them in line. Even though the peasants often outnumbered the samurai, their powerlessness was reinforced by the samurai's use of violence and intimidation. The samurai did not hesitate to punish even the smallest transgression, whether it was a failure to pay taxes or a perceived disrespect. Moreover, the social divide between the samurai and the peasants was stark, and the disdain the samurai held for the lower classes was palpable. The samurai viewed themselves as superior beings, both morally and intellectually. They believed that their martial skills and adherence to the Bushido code made them a noble and virtuous class, while the peasants were seen as mere tools to be used. This hierarchical worldview made it difficult for the lower classes to ever gain the respect of their masters, regardless of their contributions to society. The rigid social structure also meant that education and intellectual pursuits were reserved for the samurai and the elite. The peasants, by contrast, had little access to education or culture. Literacy rates were low among the common people, and the pursuit of knowledge was often seen as a luxury reserved for those who had the time and resources to engage with it. This created a society where the samurai controlled not only the physical labor of the peasants, but also their intellectual and cultural development. The peasants were kept in a state of ignorance, further reinforcing the power imbalance between the classes. The social stratification of feudal Japan, deeply ingrained in every aspect of life, was not only oppressive, but also stifled the potential for any meaningful social change. The very structure of this society, where the samurai dominated the upper echelons while peasants and lower classes languished beneath, was designed to perpetuate itself. Those born into the lower classes rarely had any hope of advancement. In this unforgiving system, even the smallest acts of resistance were met with brutal consequences, and yet the desire for change simmered beneath the surface of this rigid society. One of the most striking features of the samurai's dominance was the way it shaped the culture and psyche of the people. The samurai not only wielded power through military strength and political influence, but also through cultural and spiritual authority. Samurai were seen as paragons of virtue, bound by the strictest code of conduct, Bushido, which demanded unwavering loyalty, courage, and honor. While these ideals were admirable on the surface, they were often twisted into justifications for cruelty and exploitation. The samurai lived by a code that elevated them above all others, yet they demanded that the peasants and lower classes live in perpetual subjugation, constantly toiling for their lord's benefit. This psychological framework of superiority and subjugation worked in tandem with a system that allowed little room for personal expression or rebellion. For the samurai, maintaining honor was paramount, and any action that challenged their authority was seen as a grave offense. In contrast, peasants were seen as disposable. Their role in society was to serve and obey. This perception was solidified by the practice of keeping peasants under constant surveillance, both by their lords and by fellow villagers, who were often tasked with reporting any acts of defiance. Life under this oppressive regime meant that any form of dissent, however small, could result in devastating consequences. One of the most significant acts of resistance in feudal Japan came in the form of peasant uprisings. Despite the extreme risk, peasants occasionally rose up against their samurai masters, often driven by unbearable conditions or unjust taxation. However, these uprisings were quickly suppressed, and the consequences for rebellion were severe. The samurai did not hesitate to use overwhelming force to put down these revolts, often massacring entire villages as a lesson to others. In many cases, peasants were not only executed, but also subjected to brutal forms of punishment, such as being boiled alive or publicly impaled, as a way to instill fear in anyone considering rebellion. Despite the harshness of their lives, the peasants developed a deep sense of solidarity and community. Though they were kept in line through fear, their bonds with one another often provided them with the strength to endure the hardships of their daily existence. The shared struggle for survival, along with the common experience of being oppressed, fostered a sense of unity that transcended individual hardships. However, while this solidarity was powerful, it was often not enough to overcome the overwhelming force of the samurai's power. The system was too entrenched, and the samurai were too brutal and organized to be easily overthrown. The suffering of the peasantry was not just physical or economic, it was deeply spiritual. Religion played a significant role in the lives of the samurai and the lower classes alike, but the religious practices were often designed to reinforce the existing power structure. Buddhism, Shinto, and Confucianism, all prevalent in feudal Japan, had teachings that supported the hierarchical structure of society, with the emperor or the samurai at the top and peasants below. The samurai often used these religious teachings to justify their actions, claiming that their divine right to rule was sanctioned by the gods. This spiritual framework helped to solidify their power and authority, making it even more difficult for the lower classes to challenge the system. In the minds of the samurai, their actions were seen as divinely ordained, and the suffering of the peasants was viewed as a necessary component of maintaining order and stability. The peasants, on the other hand, had little access to religious or philosophical teachings that might have helped them understand or question their place in the world. This spiritual and intellectual oppression kept them in a state of ignorance, making it all the more difficult for them to organize or resist. The samurai, as the spiritual and intellectual leaders of the country, maintained control over not just the land, but the minds of the people as well. One of the few ways in which The peasants could express their dissatisfaction or vent. Their frustrations was through folklore, song, and oral traditions. These were the mediums through which their stories, hopes, and struggles could be passed down through generations. Although these stories often contained elements of fantasy, myth, and exaggeration, they served as a way for the people to assert their humanity in a world that saw them as little more than tools. Through these stories, peasants were able to create an identity separate from their oppressive rulers, one that was marked by resilience and the will to survive. Even though these acts of cultural expression were a form of resistance, they were not enough to dismantle the systems of power that kept the samurai in control. The peasants were stuck in a cycle of poverty and oppression that seemed inescapable. Even when the samurai faced challenges, whether from internal political strife or external invaders, the system itself remained intact. The powerful shoguns who ruled over Japan were constantly engaged in feuds with other samurai factions, but their battles did not provide the common people with any respite. In fact, wars between samurai factions often resulted in even more hardship. For the peasants, as their lands were ravaged, their resources stolen, and their lives disrupted by the violence of war. Despite this, the resilience of the peasant class should not be underestimated. They found ways to survive, to adapt, and to continue despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. They developed intricate agricultural techniques, created self-sustaining communities, and passed down knowledge from generation to generation. But their survival was not enough to free them from the shackles of the feudal system, and for many, their lives would remain marked by brutality and hardship. As we continue to examine the complexities of life in feudal Japan, it's important to understand the mechanisms that allowed this brutal system to persist for so long. The samurai, with their strict code of Bushido and their unwavering loyalty to their lords, were the backbone of feudal society. Their role was not just that of warriors, but also of enforcers of the social order. The concept of loyalty, which was central to the samurai's existence, was used as a tool to maintain the hierarchy and ensure that those in power stayed in control. At the top of this hierarchy was the emperor, a figurehead with little real power. While the emperor was revered as a divine being, the true power lay with the shogunate, the military government headed by the shogun, who was typically a member of the samurai class. The shogunate controlled the military, the economy, and the land, while the emperor's role was largely ceremonial. The emperor's position was symbolic of the divine order that supported the samurai's dominance. But in practice, the shogun and their samurai vassals made all the important decisions. The samurai's code, Bushido, was instrumental in creating a rigid hierarchical society that was incredibly difficult to escape from. The code was founded on virtues such as loyalty, honor, and discipline, which were essential to maintaining the social order. For the samurai, dishonor was the ultimate crime. If a samurai failed in their duty or betrayed their lord, they could be forced to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, to restore their honor. This concept of honor permeated every level of society, from the samurai to the peasants. For the common people, the need to uphold their own honor and loyalty to their samurai lords often meant living in constant fear of making a misstep that could cost them their lives. The loyalty demanded by the samurai was not one-sided. In return for their service, samurai were granted land and resources, which they would defend with their lives. These lands were not just their personal property, but part of the feudal system that tied the entire country together. The land was the foundation of the economy, and the peasants worked the land to provide for both the samurai and their families. The samurai relied on the labor of the peasants to sustain their way of life, and the peasants were bound to the land through their obligations to their lords. The constant need for loyalty and protection created a highly unstable society. The samurai, who were responsible for maintaining order, were often embroiled in internal conflicts and power struggles. Rival samurai factions frequently battled for control of territory, and the daimyo, the feudal lords who ruled over large domains, competed for influence. This constant state of warfare created a society where violence and destruction were seen as normal parts of life. Samurai would raid each other's lands, and entire villages would be burned to the ground in the name of power struggles. For the peasants, the instability and violence of feudal Japan meant that their lives were constantly at risk. Villages could be raided, families could be destroyed, and crops could be burned at any moment. The peasants had little say in the wars that raged around them, yet they were often forced to fight in these battles, conscripted into service by the samurai. They were expected to protect the land they worked, even if it meant sacrificing their lives. In these times, peasants were often seen as expendable. They were expected to work the fields, produce food, and provide labor, yet their lives were considered unimportant compared to the survival of the samurai class. The lack of personal agency and the constant threat of death created a society in which the lower classes had no control over their own destinies. For the samurai, their honor and loyalty to their lords were paramount. But for the peasants, their loyalty to their samurai overlords often meant that they had to sacrifice their own lives and futures for the sake of their lords' ambitions. This dynamic kept the peasants in a perpetual state of subjugation and fear. The samurai's power was absolute, and the peasants were left with little recourse for change. The feudal system was not only a political and economic structure, but also a deeply spiritual one. The samurai were seen as the defenders of order and the enforcers of justice. Their honor was tied to their service to their lords, and their success in battle was viewed as a direct reflection of their spiritual and moral worth. The peasants, on the other hand, were seen as humble and subservient, expected to uphold the harmony of society through their work and obedience. Religion played an important role in reinforcing the existing power structure. Buddhism, Shinto, and Confucianism were all practiced in feudal Japan, and each of these religions had teachings that supported the hierarchical structure of society. Buddhism, for example, taught that suffering was an inherent part of life, and that individuals must accept their place in the world. Confucianism emphasized loyalty and filial piety, reinforcing the idea that the lower classes should respect and serve their superiors without question. Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan, revered the emperor and the samurai as divine beings, further solidifying the power of the ruling class. For the peasants, religion provided a sense of solace in an otherwise harsh world. They prayed to the gods for protection from natural disasters, such as floods and earthquakes, and for help in times of famine and disease. Yet, despite their religious devotion, their prayers often went unanswered, and they were left to struggle with the daily realities of life under the samurai's rule. The teachings of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shinto did little to alleviate the suffering of the peasants, and instead they reinforced the idea that their subjugation was divinely ordained. The peasants were taught to accept their suffering, to endure hardship with patience, and to remain loyal to their samurai lords no matter how cruel they were. As we continue to explore the oppressive nature of feudal Japan, it is crucial to recognize that the pervasive violence, hardship, and subjugation endured by the lower classes were not simply isolated incidents, but were embedded in the very structure of society. The samurai, as both warriors and landowners, wielded a power that extended beyond physical combat. Their role as protectors of the social order meant that they were the enforcers of a rigid system that kept the peasantry and lower classes firmly in their place. One of the most brutal aspects of feudal Japan was the constant state of militarization. The samurai, bound by the principles of Bushido, lived in a world where war and combat were seen as not only inevitable, but necessary. The samurai were trained from a young age in the arts of war, with swordsmanship and combat tactics being integral parts of their education. The samurai's identity was tied to their ability to fight and to defend their lords, and the value of their lives was often measured by their prowess in battle. This created a society where violence was not just an occasional occurrence, but a defining feature of everyday life. For the peasants, this militarized society meant that they were frequently caught in the crossfire of feudal wars. During times of peace, they were still required to provide labor and resources to the samurai. During times of war, however, their lives were even more perilous. The constant threat of samurai raids, the destruction of crops, and the disruption of their villages made survival an ongoing challenge. Samurai were often called upon to defend their land and protect their resources, and in doing so they would clash with rival factions, bandits, or even other samurai. As the peasants had no army of their own, they were left vulnerable to the whims of their samurai overlords and the chaos of war. The violent nature of feudal society permeated not only military conflicts, but also daily interactions. The samurai used their martial skills to assert their dominance over the peasants, with sword fighting and physical intimidation being tools of control. Samurai would regularly patrol the land, ensuring that their subjects complied with the rigid codes of conduct. Peasants were expected to bow and show deference to the samurai, and any failure to do so could lead to brutal punishment. The fear of samurai violence was a constant presence in the lives of the lower classes, and many peasants lived in perpetual anxiety about their safety and well-being. The psychological toll of living in such an oppressive society was profound. For the peasants, there was no escape from the brutal reality of their existence. They were bound to their land, subject to the whims of their samurai masters, and isolated from any form of social mobility. Even if they managed to work hard and earn some wealth, they could never escape their role in society. The fear of punishment, of losing their land, or of being caught in the violence of war loomed over every aspect of their lives. Perhaps one of the most tragic elements of feudal Japan was the dehumanizing effect it had on both the samurai and the peasants. While the samurai were elevated by their adherence to Bushido, the rigid code of honor that demanded loyalty, discipline, and martial skill, their lives were also marked by immense pressure. The pressure to uphold honor and to serve their lords, without question, often led samurai to engage in brutal acts of violence. Samurai who failed to live up to the expectations of their code could face the ultimate punishment, seppuku, or ritual suicide. This cultural expectation placed a tremendous burden on samurai, forcing them to constantly prove their worth and honor through violence. For the peasants, this same code reinforced the idea that their lives were expendable. The peasants were seen as tools to be used by the samurai, and their lives were often reduced to nothing more than the labor they could provide. The samurai's rigid belief in their own superiority, supported by the Bushido code, meant that the peasants were forced to serve them without question. Even when their lives were marked by suffering and hardship, the peasants were expected to remain loyal and obedient to their samurai masters, as any defiance would result in swift and brutal punishment. This dehumanization of the lower classes was reflected in the treatment of women as well. While the samurai were held to a high standard of honor, the women in feudal Japan were bound by societal expectations that saw them as nothing more than tools for producing heirs and maintaining family honor. Women, especially those in samurai, families had little say in their own lives. Marriages were often arranged, and women were expected to serve their husbands and families. Any deviation from these expectations could result in dishonor and punishment. For peasant women, life was similarly harsh. Their lives were defined by labor, childbearing, and obedience, with little chance for autonomy or self-expression. The rigidly hierarchical structure of feudal Japan was not just a political system, it was a way of life that shaped every aspect of society. The samurai held all the power, and the lower classes, including peasants, artisans, and women, were left to serve them in a world that was deeply oppressive. For the samurai, their power was justified by their adherence to Bushido and the divine right to rule, while for the peasants, the only path to survival was to submit to their overlords and endure the harsh conditions that defined their lives. The cruelty and brutality of feudal Japan were not merely the result of a few bad actors. They were the product of a deeply ingrained system that valued power, loyalty, and honor above all else. The peasants, artisans, and women of feudal Japan were caught in a cycle of exploitation and violence that seemed almost impossible to break. While some rebelled, most endured in silence, knowing that the consequences of resistance would be severe. The samurai, despite their honor and virtue, were ultimately complicit in a system that allowed for unimaginable suffering to persist, all in the name of maintaining control and preserving their own power. As we delve further into the hardships faced by the common people in feudal Japan, it's important to understand how this brutal system of oppression impacted the lives of individuals in ways that went far beyond the physical and economic. The very structure of feudal society created a sense of despair and hopelessness that permeated nearly every aspect of daily life for those living at the bottom of the social ladder. The psychological burden of living in constant fear and servitude shaped the minds of the peasants, and their culture was largely defined by their subjugation. In a society that valued honor, loyalty, and obedience above all else, the peasants were taught to accept their lot in life without question. From a very young age, the social hierarchy was reinforced, with the samurai at the top and the peasants at the bottom. This rigid class system left little room for individual ambition or personal growth. The concept of upward mobility was nearly non-existent. If you were born a peasant, there was little chance of ever rising above your station. It was a world in which one's social position was determined at birth, and there was no escape from the crushing weight of expectation. The samurai, for all their talk of honor and virtue, were often just as trapped in the system as the peasants. The expectations placed on them by their code of Bushido were immense. They were required to be warriors at all times, constantly ready to defend their honor and their lord's interests. This military lifestyle was not one of leisure. It required intense training and discipline, often starting at a young age. Samurai had to perfect their skills in swordsmanship, archery, and strategy, and many spent their entire lives preparing for battle. However, while their training and code may have elevated them in status, it did little to ease the pressures they faced within their own class. Despite their privileged position in society, the samurai were also forced to live under strict codes of conduct that governed their behavior. The principles of Bushido demanded loyalty, self-control, and honor in every aspect of life. For the samurai, failure to live up to these ideals could result in disgrace, and the ultimate punishment for dishonor was seppuku, a ritual suicide. In a way, the samurai were also trapped by the system they served. They had to continually prove their worth, not just on the battlefield, but in every interaction, from how they treated their peers to how they upheld the reputation of their families. While the samurai had the power to maintain control over the peasants and lower classes, they were also caught in a system of violence and obligation. The perpetual state of warfare that characterized much of feudal Japan, especially during the Warring States period, added another layer of complexity to the lives of the samurai. Samurai were constantly engaged in conflicts between rival factions, which often meant they were far from home for long periods of time. During these absences, their families were left vulnerable to both external threats and internal strife. These familial struggles created additional emotional and psychological burdens for samurai warriors, as the pressure to succeed on the battlefield was not only personal, but also deeply tied to the well-being and survival of their families. The psychological effects of living in such a high-stakes, honor-driven society were not limited to the samurai alone. The peasants too bore the psychological scars of living under the constant threat of violence, hunger, and punishment. For many peasants, the fear of angering their samurai lords or failing to meet the crushing demands of their tax burdens was a daily source of anxiety. Punishments for failure could range from flogging to execution, but the psychological toll was perhaps even more significant. Living with the constant fear of punishment, combined with the knowledge that their social position offered little hope for a better life, created an atmosphere of hopelessness that shaped the worldview of the lower classes. In addition to the harsh economic conditions, peasants also suffered from a lack of basic freedoms. They were bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without permission from their lord. This meant that the peasants had little control over their own destinies. Even if they managed to earn enough resources to improve their lives, they could not simply move to another area or change their occupation. They were forever tied to the land, which only reinforced the sense of entrapment they felt. The feudal system ensured that the peasants would remain in their place for their entire lives, as the samurai controlled every aspect of their existence. This lack of mobility and personal agency was one of the key factors that kept the lower classes in such a vulnerable position. They could not escape the violence or the harshness of their world, and any attempt to challenge the system was met with severe consequences. Peasants who dared to rise up against their masters, even in the face of extreme injustice, were often brutally crushed. Many uprisings were suppressed before they could gain any real traction, and the samurai used overwhelming force to ensure that the lower classes remained in their place. Even the few instances of rebellion, such as the Jokyu Rebellion of 1221, which saw the imperial court challenging the authority of the shogunate, were ultimately crushed by samurai forces. The daimyo, feudal lords, who governed Japan's territories, were quick to rally behind the shogunate and stamp out any efforts to disrupt the established order. These revolts were not necessarily born from a desire for revolution, but from the unbearable conditions the peasants lived under. Yet no matter how just the cause, the power of the samurai class was too great to overcome. For the peasants, the reality of rebellion was that it would result only in more suffering and repression. In addition to the physical and psychological toll, the feudal system in Japan also imposed a deeply emotional burden on the lower classes. For women in particular, life in feudal Japan was marked by severe limitations on freedom and opportunity. Women were expected to serve the needs of their husbands and families, and they had little agency over their own lives. The vast majority of women were bound by the social structures that determined their roles, and even the elite women, married into samurai families, had little power over their own destinies. In many cases, women were seen as little more than property, traded between families for political alliances and economic gain. As we move forward, we begin to understand how deeply ingrained the suffering and exploitation of the lower classes were in feudal Japan. The peasants, artisans, and women lived under a system that left little room for personal agency, advancement, or dignity. Their lives were shaped by a rigid and unforgiving hierarchy, where their social status was not only predetermined at birth, but reinforced through every aspect of their existence. The samurai, though revered for their discipline and honor, were often just as trapped in this system, forced to uphold a code of conduct that demanded the preservation of a societal order that perpetuated inequality and suffering. The relentless cycle of oppression, violence, and exploitation left little room for hope or change. The peasants, despite their hard work and resilience, were forced to live in a constant state of fear and anxiety. They were exploited by the samurai, subjected to brutal punishment for even the smallest infractions, and trapped in a system that offered no way out. Their labor was the backbone of the economy, yet they were treated as expendable, their lives seen as little more than tools to sustain the privileged class. The land they worked on, though essential to their survival, was owned by the samurai, and any attempts to claim it for themselves were met with violence. For many peasants, the idea of upward mobility, of changing their social status or improving their lives, was a distant fantasy. The rigid class system ensured that the lower classes remained in their place, while the samurai, despite their internal struggles and conflicts, were able to preserve their dominance. The peasants had no access to the privileges of education, art, or leisure, and their opportunities for personal growth or development were virtually non-existent. The constant focus on survival left little time or energy for anything else. Even their most basic needs, such as food, shelter, and safety, were dictated by the whims of the samurai and daimyo. The emotional burden of living in such an oppressive society was immense. The peasants lived in a world where hope was a luxury they could not afford, and fear was their constant companion. The threat of punishment for failing to meet the demands of their lords was ever present, and many peasants lived in constant anxiety over what the next day might bring. They were subjected to grueling labor in the fields, often working from dawn until dusk. Yet the fruits of their labor rarely benefited them. The samurai, who controlled the land, took the majority of the crops, leaving the peasants with only enough to sustain their families. If the harvest was poor, the peasants would still be forced to pay the same high taxes, despite having little to offer. The emotional toll on women in feudal Japan was equally devastating. Women, whether they were from peasant or samurai families, were often seen as little more than property. Their lives were dictated by the roles they were expected to fulfill: wife, mother, and caretaker. In samurai families, women were expected to uphold their family's honor and ensure the continuation of the family line. Their marriages were arranged, and they had little say in their own futures. If a woman's husband died, her life became even more precarious, as widowhood was considered a dishonorable state. Women were often forced to remarry quickly to avoid the shame of being left alone, and even their emotional well-being was seen as secondary to the family's reputation. In peasant families, women were expected to help with agricultural work, raising children, and maintaining the household. Their work was essential to the family's survival, yet they had little control over their own lives. The burden of labor was grueling, and their contributions were often taken for granted. Women's worth was primarily tied to their ability to bear children and serve their husbands. The idea of female autonomy was virtually non-existent, and any deviation from their prescribed roles was met with harsh judgment. For the samurai women, the pressures of upholding their family's honor were even more pronounced. They were taught from a young age to be obedient, to serve their husbands and to maintain their dignity. A samurai woman's life was largely confined to the home, where she was expected to manage the household and bear children. Her primary role was to ensure the smooth functioning of the family, and any failure to do so could result in dishonor. In extreme cases, the shame of dishonoring the family could lead to punishment or even death, as the family's reputation was considered more important than the individual's life. Despite the severe limitations placed on women, many found ways to resist, to carve out small moments of independence and to express their own desires. Some samurai women took part in the military struggles of their time, fighting alongside their husbands or sons when necessary. Others used their roles in the family to influence decisions and to preserve their family's power. However, these acts of resistance were rare, and women's voices were often silenced by the societal structures that sought to maintain order through subjugation. For the peasants, the ability to resist was even more limited. While some attempted to rebel or resist the oppression they faced, these uprisings were often short-lived. The samurai, with their military power and control over the land, quickly crushed any form of rebellion. The peasants, knowing that their chances of success were slim, often had no choice but to accept their fate and continue their labor, always under the watchful eyes of their lords. The idea of resistance was not only dangerous, but futile for most peasants, who were too powerless to challenge the entrenched power structures of feudal Japan. While there were moments of rebellion and resistance, they were often seen as acts of desperation, rather than as a means of achieving social change. The system that kept the samurai in power was too deeply ingrained for any significant transformation to take place. Even when change came to Japan, it often came through violence and upheaval, as was the case during the Meiji Restoration, when the samurai themselves were overthrown in the face of modernization and political change. As we move further into the grim reality of life in feudal Japan, it becomes increasingly clear how deeply the feudal system was woven into the very fabric of Japanese society. The persistent oppression of the lower classes, especially the peasants and women, was not merely a series of unfortunate events, but a result of a deeply entrenched system designed to maintain control, prevent social mobility, and ensure that power remained concentrated in the hands of the samurai and their feudal lords. However, there were moments in history when the pressures of this oppressive system came to a boiling point, creating a situation ripe for rebellion. Yet the samurai class's iron grip over the land and people ensured that uprisings rarely succeeded. Despite their dire circumstances, peasants had moments of hope, often in the form of rebellion or attempts to challenge their exploitation. These uprisings, while born out of desperation, were nevertheless symbolic of the deep anger and frustration that simmered among the oppressed. For the peasants, who were already subject to high taxes, harsh labor, and constant threats from both their samurai overlords and external natural forces, the idea of resistance was often the only means by which they could express their suffering and demand change. However, resistance was met with brutal force. One of the most notable uprisings in feudal Japan was the Onin War, 1467-1477, a civil war that arose from power struggles between rival samurai clans. The war ultimately devastated much of Japan, leading to widespread destruction, loss of life, and destabilization of the feudal order. While the Onin War itself was a conflict between samurai factions, its aftermath affected the lower classes just as much. The destruction of farmland, the breakdown of social order, and the disruption of agricultural life left the peasants vulnerable to starvation, disease, and further exploitation. This war marked the beginning of the Sengoku, Warring States period, a time when the samurai were not only engaged in constant conflict with each other, but also in conflicts that involved the peasants as unwilling participants. The Sengoku period, 1467 to 1603, saw the fragmentation of Japan's political structure, with the central government weakened and various warlords or daimyo fighting for power. The peasants, already enduring harsh conditions, were dragged into this chaos. Samurai factions would often forcibly conscript peasants into their armies, or demand food, shelter, and resources from them, further deepening their suffering. The constant wars left the peasants with no place to turn for relief, and as a result they were often forced to participate in the very violence that subjugated them. In this period of upheaval, peasants began to form larger, more organized uprisings. While these rebellions were often crushed swiftly and with extreme violence, they reflected a growing sense of unity and shared suffering among the lower classes. These revolts were often sparked by famine, injustice, or the unbearable weight of taxation, but the peasants were systematically defeated by the overwhelming military strength of the samurai. The most famous of these uprisings was the Shinshu peasant uprising of 1560, where farmers rose up against the daimyo and samurai who imposed crushing taxes. Though the rebellion was quelled, it marked a significant moment in the history of peasant resistance. While samurai were renowned for their martial prowess, their reliance on the lower classes for labor and resources meant that these uprisings were always a danger. The samurai class understood that if the peasants ever unified against them, their control over the land would be in jeopardy. However, the samurai's response to any insurrection was swift and brutal, often resulting in the complete eradication of entire villages or the public execution of leaders. These violent reprisals ensured that, while the peasants might protest or resist, they could never challenge the status quo for long. Despite the ongoing brutality, the feudal system eventually began to show signs of internal decay. The samurai class, which had once been united by a shared code of honor, found itself increasingly divided in the face of external challenges. As Japan entered the Edo period, 1603–1868, the shogunate, which had once relied on the samurai's military power to maintain control, had to turn to increasingly authoritarian measures to keep the lower classes in line. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan during this time, took steps to suppress any potential uprisings by imposing stricter laws and creating a more formalized class structure. The Tokugawa period, while marked by relative peace and stability, compared to the Sengoku period, was still rife with social injustice. Samurai retained their power, but much of their time was spent enforcing the status quo, which meant increasing taxes on the peasantry and exploiting them to sustain the wealth of the samurai elite. While Japan was technically in a state of peace during this time, the peasants continued to suffer under the weight of oppressive taxation, and their lives were largely dictated by the needs and desires of the samurai class. The rigid class structure of feudal Japan also had a profound impact on the cultural and intellectual development of the period. While the samurai were often seen as the intellectual and spiritual leaders of Japan, their education was primarily focused on warfare, military, strategy, and maintaining control over their domains. In contrast, the peasants were largely denied access to education and intellectual pursuits. The few exceptions were the artisans and merchants, who, despite their relative wealth, were still considered to be of lower status than the samurai. The peasants had no access to formal education. Their knowledge was primarily practical, passed down through generations in the form of folk traditions, agricultural knowledge, and oral histories. While samurai were educated in literature, poetry, and philosophy, the peasants had little exposure to these intellectual pursuits. As a result, there was a stark divide between the intellectual and cultural life of the samurai and the practical, survival-oriented life of the peasants. This divide ensured that the lower classes remained unaware of the broader cultural and philosophical movements that were taking place, further entrenching their subjugation. The lack of education for the lower classes meant that even when the feudal system began to break down, the peasants were largely unprepared to navigate the changing political landscape. The Meiji Restoration, 1868, which marked the end of feudal rule and the beginning of Japan's modernization, was a time of dramatic change. However, it was also a time of great upheaval for the peasants, who had long been excluded from the political and intellectual currents of the time. As Japan rapidly transformed into a modern industrialized nation, many peasants found themselves unable to adapt to the new system, and the old feudal hierarchies gave way to new forms of inequality. As we examine the transformation of feudal Japan, we see that despite the collapse of the formal feudal system during the Meiji Restoration, 1868, the cultural, social, and psychological scars left by centuries of subjugation would remain long after the samurai lost their power. The Meiji Restoration marked a profound shift in Japan's political landscape, ending centuries of feudal rule and establishing a centralized government under the emperor. However, this shift did not immediately lift the burdens of the lower classes, who had lived under the samurai's oppression for centuries. The samurai themselves, though no longer in power, also struggled to find their place in the rapidly changing society. The Meiji Restoration was intended to modernize Japan and align it with the Western powers of the time. The new government, seeking to strengthen Japan and prevent colonization, sought to eliminate the traditional feudal structures that had kept the samurai class at the top of society. The samurai's privileges were stripped away, and they were forced to give up their lands and titles in exchange for compensation. The shogunate was abolished, and a centralized government was established in its place. In theory, this was a step toward greater equality, but for many peasants and commoners, the changes were not immediately beneficial. While the Meiji period brought significant economic and industrial growth to Japan, the peasants who had long struggled under the feudal system found themselves still grappling with the legacy of their past. The newfound centralization of power in the imperial government did not immediately result in improved conditions for the lower classes. The samurai class, which had once been responsible for enforcing the laws and protecting the peasants, was replaced by a modern army and bureaucracy, but the burden of taxation and the exploitation of the peasantry continued. The samurai were no longer present in their former capacity, but their legacy persisted in the new system of government that still heavily taxed the agricultural class. Moreover, the sense of powerlessness that had plagued the peasants for centuries did not disappear with the fall of the shogunate. The peasants were still bound to the land, still subject to the whims of a powerful elite, and their lives were still controlled by the demands of a society that viewed them as inferior. The new government sought to modernize Japan quickly, and this rapid pace of industrialization left many peasants struggling to keep up. The land reforms promised by the Meiji government were often insufficient, and the promise of land ownership for the peasants did little to change the fact that the government continued to demand high taxes and labor from them. The shift from a feudal society to a modern industrialized nation did little to erase the cultural and psychological effects of centuries of oppression. The lower classes, though no longer under the direct control of the samurai, still faced the enduring legacy of a society that had taught them to accept their subordinate position. The peasants had been taught that their role in society was to serve the samurai and maintain the agricultural backbone of the economy, and this mentality did not change overnight. The deep-rooted hierarchical culture that had defined feudal Japan continued to shape social relations long after the samurai were gone. The modernizing government of the Meiji era sought to foster a sense of national pride and unity among the Japanese people. But this was easier said than done. The peasants, who had long been excluded from political power and had few opportunities for education, found it difficult to fully participate in the new national identity that was being forged. While the samurai had once represented the moral and spiritual center of Japan, their legacy now became something of a relic, with the samurai class forced to adapt to the new social order or fade into obscurity. The lower classes, on the other hand, remained in the shadows of the new society, their voices largely unheard. As the Meiji period progressed, Japan experienced tremendous social and economic changes. Industrialization and urbanization transformed the country, and the rise of the merchant and industrial classes challenged the traditional social order. However, these changes often left the peasants behind. The shift to industrial agriculture, along with the heavy burden of taxation and rising costs of living, made it even more difficult for the rural population to survive. The rapid pace of change also disrupted the traditional village structures, where peasants had once found some degree of community support. As rural life began to break down, peasants were forced to migrate to urban areas where they faced the challenges of overcrowding, poverty, and exploitation in factories. The emotional and psychological scars left by feudal Japan's brutal system remained even as Japan modernized. For many of the older generation, the sense of being subjugated and powerless was a deeply ingrained part of their identity. The trauma of living under the constant threat of violence and oppression had left many with a sense of fatalism. The idea that one's fate was tied to the land, to the will of their lords, and to a rigid social structure that offered little opportunity for change became ingrained in the minds of the peasants. Despite the abolition of feudalism, many peasants continued to feel powerless in the face of their new challenges. This deep sense of historical trauma was also felt by the samurai who had once been the rulers of Japan. While they no longer had political power, their sense of loss was profound. They had been taught that their role in society was sacred, that their honor was their highest virtue, and that their martial skills and loyalty to their lords defined their worth. With the fall of the samurai class, many of them struggled to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Some samurai turned to military service in the new imperial army, while others became bureaucrats, scholars, or teachers. The sense of identity that had once defined the samurai was gone, and many of them were left to grapple with their place in a society that no longer valued their traditional roles. As Japan transitioned from feudalism to modernization during the Meiji Restoration, the social structures and psychological scars left by centuries of hierarchical oppression did not disappear instantly. While the physical dismantling of the feudal system marked the beginning of a new era, the underlying cultural and emotional damage persisted for generations. The Meiji era, which ushered in industrialization, political centralization, and significant changes to Japan's social order, was a period of profound contradiction. For some, it promised progress, wealth, and a future in line with the Western powers. For others, particularly the former peasants and samurai, the rapid changes often felt like a loss of identity and purpose, leaving them to navigate a world that no longer reflected their former lives. In the wake of the Meiji Restoration, the samurai class, stripped of their privileges and formal roles, faced a crisis of identity. No longer revered as the elite warriors and landowners who upheld Japan's social order, they were now tasked with adapting to a rapidly changing society that no longer had a place for them. The samurai were no longer allowed to carry swords in public or collect the taxes they once commanded. They had to find new roles in the Meiji government or face the painful reality of losing their place in society altogether. Some samurai tried to retain their former status by becoming bureaucrats, military officers, or educators, but many found it difficult to reconcile their traditional warrior ethos with the demands of a modern, industrialized society. The emotional toll of these changes on the samurai was significant. For centuries, the samurai had been taught that their honor, their skill with the sword, and their loyalty to their lords were the defining characteristics of their identity. The loss of these elements left many samurai feeling disoriented and unsure of their place in the new world. Some experienced feelings of betrayal and despair as their entire way of life was uprooted. The trauma of this loss manifested in several ways, through disillusionment, frustration, and sometimes violent resistance to change. One example of this resistance was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by former samurai who fought against the new Meiji government in an attempt to preserve the old order. The rebellion, though ultimately crushed, symbolized the deep sense of loss and the desperation of the samurai to hold on to their past. However, as the Meiji period continued, the shift to a more industrialized economy and a more centralized political structure also created opportunities for new social mobility, albeit in ways that were often more exploitative and less centered on personal honor. While the peasantry, for the most part, remained at the bottom of the social hierarchy, the emerging merchant and industrial classes began to gain power and wealth. The government policies of the Meiji era, including the introduction of modern taxation systems and land reforms, sought to consolidate power and make Japan competitive on the world stage. But in practice, these policies often exacerbated the gap between the rich and the poor, with the urban merchant classes benefiting at the expense of the rural population. For the peasants, the Meiji Restoration offered a double-edged sword. The promise of land reforms, which granted peasants ownership of the land they had worked, was an important step in the modernization of Japan's agrarian system. However, the land reforms were often insufficient and left many peasants still struggling under high taxes. In many cases, peasants who had once worked for the samurai now found themselves working for the state, struggling to pay off debts and taxes that they had little means to afford. While some peasants were able to gain land and prosper, many remained trapped in the same cycle of poverty and oppression that had defined their lives under feudalism. This gap between the promise of reform and the reality of peasant life led to continued resentment and hardship. Moreover, the advent of industrialization in the Meiji era brought new challenges for peasants who had traditionally worked the land. Urbanization saw many peasants migrate to cities in search of work, but the conditions in the rapidly growing industrial centers were grim. Factories were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unsafe, and workers, many of them former peasants, were subjected to grueling hours and low wages. The shift from a rural agrarian lifestyle to the harsh and exploitative conditions of factory labor did little to improve the lives of many peasants. While Japan became increasingly industrialized, the poor continued to bear the brunt of this transformation. The emotional and psychological scars left by centuries of feudal oppression did not vanish with the fall of the shogunate and the rise of the Meiji government. Many former peasants, still living in poverty, found themselves unable to adapt to the new demands of industrial society. The new Meiji government had promised modernization and equality, but in practice, it often deepened the social divide. The samurai, no longer in power, were left to grapple with the loss of their identity, while the peasants continued to bear the weight of an exploitative economic system. Both groups, despite the outward appearance of progress, were emotionally and psychologically scarred by the transition. For the lower classes, the changes brought by the Meiji Restoration were often nothing more than an illusion of freedom. While many had hoped for a better life under the new government, they often found themselves trapped in the same oppressive cycles of labor, poverty, and exploitation. The psychological burden of centuries of servitude was not easily erased, and the lower classes found themselves struggling to adapt to the fast-changing world with little support or guidance. As Japan entered the 20th century, the remnants of its feudal past, social hierarchies, class division, and the psychological scars of oppression remained woven into the fabric of Japanese society. The Meiji period had transformed Japan into a modern power, but it had not solved the fundamental issues of inequality and exploitation that had existed for centuries. The trauma of feudal oppression continued to affect the peasants, the samurai, and the emerging industrial classes alike, shaping the country's identity as it moved forward into an uncertain future. As Japan's society rapidly evolved during the Meiji Restoration, the psychological and cultural shifts within the lower classes became more pronounced. The once rigid social hierarchy, designed to keep peasants in their place, now faced unprecedented challenges. With the samurai class officially dissolved and the power of the daimyo eroded, Japan was forced to reckon with the long-lasting consequences of centuries of feudal rule. The new Meiji government, despite its modernization efforts, could not fully address the deep emotional scars left by the former class system. These scars shaped not only the experiences of peasants and samurai, but also influenced the broader trajectory of Japan's transition to a modern state. One of the most significant consequences of the Meiji government's reform efforts was the push toward a more centralized, bureaucratic society. With the shogunate disbanded, the Meiji leaders sought to consolidate power and create a more cohesive nation-state. This involved dismantling many of the traditional structures that had once supported feudal Japan's agricultural economy, including the land holdings of the samurai and the feudal lords. However, the changes implemented by the Meiji government were not evenly distributed, and the resulting economic system continued to leave the lower classes at a disadvantage. For the peasants, the promise of land reform during the Meiji period was a double-edged sword. While the new government sought to distribute land more equally among peasants, it failed to address the systemic issues that had plagued the rural economy for centuries. The land reforms often fell short of providing true economic autonomy, and many peasants found themselves burdened with high taxes that drained their already limited resources. As the country industrialized, the burden on the rural population grew heavier. The new tax system, combined with the economic demands of modernization, left little room for peasants to rise above their station. For many, the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial one seemed more like a shift from one form of exploitation to another. The shift to industrialization also created a psychological divide. As urban areas grew and factory systems expanded, peasants who had once lived close-knit village lives found themselves torn from their familiar environments and thrust into the harsh conditions of factory labor. The transition from agrarian work to industrial factory work proved difficult for many, both physically and mentally. The rigid, relentless pace of industrialization came with its own set of emotional and psychological burdens. Workers, many of whom were former peasants, were subjected to grueling hours, unsafe working conditions, and meager wages. The factories, often overcrowded and poorly regulated, became a place where the emotional trauma of feudal life was compounded by the harsh realities of industrial labor. For former samurai, the emotional toll of the Meiji Restoration was equally profound. Stripped of their status and privileges, many samurai found themselves disillusioned and uncertain of their place in the new society. The loss of their position as the elite ruling class left many with a sense of deep identity crisis. Samurai who had once lived by a strict code of honor now found themselves marginalized in a society that no longer had a place for them. Some samurai adapted by joining the new imperial army or taking roles in the burgeoning bureaucratic state, but many struggled with feelings of inadequacy and loss. The Meiji Restoration had obliterated the samurai's role as the spiritual and moral leaders of Japan, leaving them grappling with their own sense of honor in a rapidly changing world. The Meiji period also marked the beginning of Japan's efforts to present itself as a modern power on the world stage. This new national identity, focused on industrialization, military strength, and political centralization, often ignored the social and emotional needs of the lower classes. The government's emphasis on creating a strong national identity through economic and military power meant that the voices of the peasants and former samurai, still reeling from the trauma of feudalism, were largely overlooked. The promise of equality and prosperity was still an illusion for many, and the psychological damage caused by centuries of feudal oppression continued to shape the lives of the people. The cultural shift during the Meiji period further contributed to the sense of dislocation and loss felt by many. As Japan rapidly embraced Western ideas and technologies, the traditional ways of life that had defined Japan for centuries were uprooted. The samurai class, which had once been the embodiment of Japanese culture and values, was no longer central to the nation's identity. The traditional feudal system, which had provided structure and meaning to the lives of many, was replaced by a new, more westernized social order that often seemed alien to those who had grown up in the rigid confines of the old system. For many of the peasants who had lived through feudal oppression, the arrival of Western influences only deepened their sense of alienation. They were caught between two worlds: the traditional world of feudal Japan, where their lives were dictated by their samurai overlords, and the new industrialized world of the Meiji era, which offered them little hope of true social mobility or equality. The emotional and psychological scars of feudalism had left deep wounds, and many peasants felt that the new government's promises of modernization and progress were out of reach. Women, too, experienced the effects of this shift in Japan's social order. The Meiji period brought some reforms to women's rights, but these changes were limited and often superficial. Women's roles continued to be defined by traditional ideas of marriage, motherhood, and household management. Although the Meiji government began to promote women's education and economic participation, the pace of change was slow. For many women, the social expectations of their roles remained largely unchanged, and they continued to face the psychological and emotional burdens of being treated as inferior to men. As Japan continued its transition from feudalism to modernization, the emotional and psychological struggles faced by the lower classes, peasants, former samurai, and women, remained profound. Despite the Meiji Restoration's promise of equality, economic opportunity, and national pride, the realities for many were far more complex. The social and cultural upheaval left many feeling disconnected from the very system that was meant to bring progress. This period, while marked by economic and military growth, also amplified the deep-seated fears, frustrations, and trauma that had plagued Japanese society for centuries. One of the most significant challenges for the lower classes in the Meiji period was the relentless pace of industrialization. As Japan adopted Western technologies and practices, the economy rapidly shifted from an agrarian-based one to an industrialized economy. For the peasants, this meant being thrust into a new world of labor that was no longer based on the rhythms of the land. Their rural communities, once centers of self-sufficiency and tradition, were transformed as they were forced to either adapt to factory labor or face increasing economic hardships. The factory system, with its long hours, poor conditions, and low wages, was a stark contrast to the agrarian lifestyle that many peasants had known. For many, the shift to industrial work felt like an intensification of their oppression. The trauma of centuries of feudal subjugation was not easily erased by the promise of modernity. The psychological toll of working in grueling conditions, without the hope of rising above their social status, left many peasants feeling defeated. They had little control over their labor and were at the mercy of factory owners who were often indifferent to their suffering. Despite the fact that Japan was quickly becoming an industrial powerhouse, the benefits of this transformation were not evenly shared, and the lower classes continued to bear the brunt of exploitation. The urbanization that accompanied industrialization also created a profound sense of displacement for many peasants. Those who migrated to the cities in search of better opportunities found themselves in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The growth of cities, while indicative of Japan's economic development, exposed the stark contrast between the flourishing of the upper classes and the stagnation of the lower classes. The peasants, who had once worked the land and enjoyed a sense of community, now found themselves in a vast, impersonal industrial landscape, struggling to survive in overcrowded slums. For former samurai, the psychological consequences of losing their status were equally severe. As a class that had long been at the top of the social hierarchy, the loss of their privileges in the Meiji era created a crisis of identity. The samurai had been defined by their honor, discipline, and martial prowess. Losing their power, land, and prestige was a blow to their sense of self-worth. Some tried to adapt by joining the new army, pursuing careers in the government, or embracing modern education, but many struggled to reconcile their traditional values with the new, rapidly changing society. The shift from a warrior class to a more bureaucratic and industrialized society forced many former samurai to confront their obsolescence in a world that no longer valued their swordsmanship or feudal loyalty. Some samurai could not adapt, falling into poverty or becoming disillusioned with the world they once helped shape. Others found themselves alienated as their honor, once a source of pride, now seemed out of place in the new world. In this sense, the Meiji Restoration was not just a political change, it was an emotional and psychological upheaval for the samurai, as they were forced to redefine their roles and their identities in a society that no longer had use for their traditional code of conduct. Women in feudal Japan had long been confined to roles that centered on domestic life and supporting male-dominated structures. While the Meiji period promised some reforms, such as greater access to education and the ability to participate in the workforce, these changes were often incremental and limited in scope. The ideal of the modern woman in Japan during the Meiji era was still very much bound by traditional roles, which emphasized the importance of marriage, motherhood, and maintaining the household. Women were expected to uphold the honor of their families, much as samurai wives had been expected to do in the past, and their emotional and psychological lives were shaped by these expectations. For many women, The Meiji reforms brought an opportunity for education, but the doors to full participation in public life remained largely closed. Women's roles in the workplace were still viewed as secondary, and social mobility was limited. Despite the government's promotion of female education and the gradual rise of women in the workforce, the rigid social structure still confined many women to the roles they had known in the past. Their access to political power remained restricted, and they were often relegated to lower-paying, unskilled work. While some women did manage to break free from traditional confines and pursue careers in education, literature, and activism, the vast majority of women continued to live under the weight of traditional expectations. The emotional burden of being part of a society that still viewed them as second-class citizens was immense for many women. The psychological toll of being forced to remain in the domestic sphere while society rapidly modernized left many women feeling frustrated and powerless. They were expected to support their families, raise children, and maintain a sense of decorum and honor, but their roles were largely confined to the private sphere. The Meiji period, with its promises of progress and modernization, was a time of profound social change, but for many women, these changes came far too slowly, and their voices continued to be muted in the public sphere. As Japan continued to modernize during the Meiji Restoration and beyond, the psychological and cultural divide between the upper and lower classes deepened. The rapid pace of industrialization, combined with the cultural and social shifts of the time, exacerbated the emotional strain experienced by the former peasants, samurai, and women. While Japan's emergence as a global power was celebrated by many, the psychological scars left by centuries of feudalism and oppression continued to affect the lives of those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. One of the key effects of modernization on the lower classes was the growing sense of alienation. As peasants were uprooted from their rural homes and moved to industrial cities in search of work, they found themselves in unfamiliar environments, overwhelmed by the harsh conditions of factory labor and urban life. The traditional village-based communities that had once offered some form of social support and solidarity were replaced by sprawling, anonymous cities. The factories, where many former peasants now worked, were harsh and dehumanizing, with workers subjected to long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. In this new industrial landscape, the peasants were no longer connected to the land they had once worked, and their sense of identity, which had been shaped by agrarian life, was lost. The alienation experienced by former peasants was compounded by the fact that they had little say in the new social order. In the past, they had been subjugated by the samurai, but now they were being exploited by factory owners and industrial capitalists. The promise of social mobility and opportunity that had been central to the Meiji government's modernization efforts did not materialize for the majority of the population. While some members of the emerging merchant and industrial classes prospered, the peasants remained trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. This left many former peasants feeling disillusioned, as the promises of reform seemed hollow in the face of the continuing hardships they faced. For former samurai, the loss of their privileged position in society was equally disorienting. The dissolution of their role as elite warriors and landowners left them struggling to redefine their identities in a world that no longer valued their martial prowess or loyalty to their lords. Many samurai, who had once been revered as the moral and spiritual backbone of Japanese society, now found themselves on the periphery. The transition from a warrior class to a bureaucratic or military role in the modernized state was a painful one, and many samurai struggled with feelings of irrelevance and loss. They had been taught to define themselves by their adherence to Bushido, a code of honor that had shaped every aspect of their lives. Now, with the loss of their traditional status, many samurai found it difficult to adapt to a society that no longer held their values in high esteem. While some samurai found new roles within the modernized military or government bureaucracy, many were left without purpose. They were no longer warriors, and their cultural identity was slowly eroded as the government promoted a more westernized and industrialized national identity. The loss of the samurai's traditional role in society was not just a political shift, it was a profound emotional and psychological trauma. For samurai who had spent their lives preparing for battle and serving their lords, the Meiji period represented a world turned upside down, where their sense of purpose and honor no longer had a place. Women in feudal Japan, as previously mentioned, had been largely confined to domestic roles, and while the Meiji Restoration brought some opportunities for education and work outside the home, these opportunities were limited and often constrained by societal expectations. The ideal of the new woman in the Meiji period, educated and empowered to participate in society, was far from the reality for most women. Although the government passed reforms that allowed women to pursue education, the cultural expectations surrounding marriage and motherhood remained firmly in place. For many women, the transition to a modern society offered no escape from the traditional roles they had been assigned. The Meiji government's emphasis on family values and the preservation of traditional gender roles meant that women's opportunities for advancement were still highly limited. They were expected to marry, bear children, and serve the needs of their families, but their participation in public life remained marginal. Even as Japan modernized, the patriarchal structures that had defined feudal Japan remained largely intact. Women were still largely excluded from political power, and their roles in the workforce were often restricted to lower-paying, unskilled jobs. For many women, the psychological burden of living in a world that valued them only for their domestic abilities was difficult to bear. While some women did break through these barriers, becoming writers, activists, or educators, the vast majority remained constrained by the expectations placed on them by society. The sense of alienation and dislocation that marked the lives of the lower classes during the Meiji era was compounded by the rapid pace of change. The promise of modernization and progress brought with it a sense of instability. The traditional way of life that had defined Japan for centuries was being replaced by a new Western-inspired social order, and the lower classes found themselves struggling to keep up. The sense of community that had once existed in rural villages was shattered as industrialization and urbanization swept across Japan. The old ways of life, tied to the land and to local customs, were being replaced by a more impersonal capitalist economy, where workers were nothing more than cogs in the machine of industrial production. For the samurai, the shift from feudalism to a modernized, centralized state left them with a profound sense of loss. The ideal of loyalty, honor, and military prowess that had defined their lives was no longer valued in the same way. In many ways, they were like the peasants, displaced and alienated in a world that no longer had a place for them. The loss of their status was not just a political change, it was a personal and emotional upheaval. For many, the trauma of this loss lingered long after the Meiji period ended, as the old world of feudal Japan was replaced by a modern, industrialized nation. As Japan continued to embrace modernization and move further away from its feudal past, the psychological trauma experienced by the lower classes, peasants, samurai, and women, became deeply intertwined with the nation's journey toward becoming a global power. The rapid transition into a modernized industrial society left many feeling disconnected from both their past and their future. For those who had lived under the rigid social structures of feudal Japan, the changes of the Meiji era were both liberating and destabilizing. The sense of alienation and loss was pervasive, as Japan's traditional ways of life were replaced by the promises and perils of industrialization. For the peasants, the rise of industrial capitalism meant that their lives were increasingly controlled by factors beyond their understanding or ability to influence. While the Meiji government promised social reform and improvement, the reality for many peasants was far less optimistic. The Meiji period brought about land reforms, but these were often insufficient to truly alleviate the economic burdens faced by the rural population. Many peasants, despite gaining nominal ownership of their land, found themselves still heavily taxed and caught in the grips of an economy that demanded more labor than they could provide. Furthermore, the taxes imposed on the peasants were often so high that they left little room for improvement or progress. For these peasants, the shift from a feudal to a modern economy was not a move toward autonomy, but a deepening of their exploitation. The expansion of factory labor and urbanization also contributed to this sense of dislocation. As the country industrialized, many peasants, particularly those from rural villages, found themselves moving to urban centers in search of work. This migration resulted in a loss of connection to their communities and traditions, further deepening the sense of alienation. Factory work, though offering higher wages in some cases, came with its own set of challenges: overcrowding, long hours, and dangerous conditions. The psychological toll of factory labor was immense, as workers were often treated as disposable commodities rather than human beings. The promise of a better life in the city, fueled by the Meiji government's push for modernization, often ended in frustration and despair. The peasants who had once worked the land now found themselves working under far more brutal conditions, with little more to show for their labor than what they had in the countryside. For the samurai, the emotional burden of the Meiji Restoration was one of the most significant challenges of the era. The dissolution of their privileged status, the loss of their land and titles, and the redefinition of their role in society caused deep psychological turmoil. Samurai were taught from a young age to value honor, loyalty, and their duty to their lords. But with the abolition of the feudal system, their lives lost meaning and structure. The samurai, once revered as warriors and protectors of Japan's spiritual and military integrity, now found themselves marginalized and irrelevant. For many, the ideal of Bushido, the samurai code, became a relic of the past, something that no longer had a place in the new, Western-influenced society. In an attempt to maintain their honor and sense of purpose, some samurai chose to fight against the changes brought by the Meiji government. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by the former samurai Saigo Takamori, became the most famous attempt to preserve the old feudal order. The rebellion, although ultimately unsuccessful, symbolized the pain and disillusionment felt by many samurai who could not reconcile their traditional values with the changing political and social landscape. The defeat of the rebellion marked the definitive end of the samurai class as a ruling force in Japanese society. However, it also served as a reminder of the deep emotional and psychological wounds that the samurai carried from the loss of their way of life. For the women of feudal Japan, the Meiji Restoration brought mixed blessings. While the period brought new opportunities for education and some legal reforms, these changes were far from transformative. Women were still primarily confined to the domestic sphere, expected to marry, bear children, and maintain the honor of their families. The idea of women's education and participation in the workforce gained traction, but the scope of these reforms was limited. The Meiji government still emphasized traditional family values, and women were expected to uphold these values by maintaining the household and raising the next generation of Japanese citizens. Despite the reforms that allowed women to attend schools and engage in some professional activities, many women were still constrained by the deeply patriarchal structure that had defined Japanese society for centuries. The emotional toll on women during the Meiji period was significant. While some women did manage to break free from traditional gender roles and pursue careers in education, literature, and activism, the vast majority still found themselves trapped in a system that valued their contributions only in the context of their families. Women's lives were still largely defined by marriage and motherhood, and any deviation from this ideal was seen as dishonorable. Even as the Meiji government began to introduce reforms that allowed women to participate in society in new ways, the pace of change was too slow for most women to experience any meaningful social mobility. The psychological burden of living in a society that restricted women's rights and opportunities was immense, and it left many women feeling powerless to change their circumstances. For all classes, the rapid pace of change during the Meiji period forced a reassessment of what it meant to be Japanese. The cultural shift toward westernization and modernization left many feeling that their traditional values and way of life were being swept aside. This created a collective sense of dislocation and anxiety. While Japan sought to catch up with Western powers and build a modern industrial economy, the emotional toll of this transformation on its citizens was often overlooked. The trauma of feudalism, which had shaped the lives of peasants, samurai, and women for centuries, was not easily overcome. The promises of progress and equality made by the Meiji government were often empty for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, who continued to bear the psychological scars of a system that had taught them their place. As Japan progressed through the Meiji period into the early 20th century, the growing tension between modernization and the lingering psychological wounds of the past remained a pervasive issue for the lower classes. While the country as a whole was transitioning into a global power, the trauma and emotional weight of centuries of feudal oppression were not easily erased. For peasants, former samurai, and women, the Meiji Restoration promised new opportunities, but it also came with a sense of loss, displacement, and struggle to find a place in the rapidly changing world. One of the most significant aspects of the Meiji period was the creation of a centralized bureaucratic government that aimed to modernize Japan and consolidate power. The samurai, who had once been the military and moral backbone of Japan's society, were stripped of their land and power. The Meiji government sought to eliminate the traditional feudal class structure, creating a more Western-style system of governance. While this shift helped to modernize Japan politically and economically, it also left a generation of samurai in crisis. No longer valued for their swordsmanship or their loyalty to lords, they were forced to adapt to new roles in government or the military, which created a sense of alienation. For the samurai, the loss of their traditional roles was not just a matter of social standing. It was an emotional and psychological upheaval. The samurai code of Bushido had taught them to value honor above all else, and with the loss of their privilege and prestige, many samurai struggled with a sense of worthlessness. Some sought solace in the military or civil service, but for others, the inability to find a role in the new society led to feelings of frustration, anger, and disillusionment. The Satsuma Rebellion, led by the disillusioned samurai, was a poignant expression of this struggle. a violent and tragic attempt to restore the old order. Though the rebellion was crushed, it highlighted the emotional devastation experienced by many samurai who could not reconcile their traditional values with the reality of Meiji Japan. Peasants, too, faced immense psychological burdens during this period. Despite the land reforms that granted them ownership of the land they worked, the economic system that emerged during the Meiji period continued to exploit the rural population. Taxation remained a significant burden, and many peasants found themselves in debt, unable to rise above their social station. While the Meiji government encouraged industrialization and urban migration, the promise of a better life in the cities often turned out to be an illusion. Many peasants who migrated to urban areas to find factory work encountered overcrowded, unsafe living conditions, long hours, and low wages. The factory system, which was integral to Japan's industrialization, provided the lower classes with little more than grueling, dehumanizing work. The emotional toll of industrialization and urbanization was felt acutely by peasants who had once lived in rural villages, close to their land and community. The dislocation of moving to urban centers, combined with the harsh realities of factory work, left many feeling alienated and powerless. The psychological trauma of these changes was compounded by the fact that many peasants were unable to adapt to the rapid pace of industrialization. They found themselves trapped in a cycle of exploitation, working long hours in dangerous factories or enduring constant financial strain as they struggled to pay taxes on land they could scarcely afford to maintain. For women, the Meiji period was marked by a complex interplay of new opportunities and continued societal limitations. While the Meiji government did encourage women's education and the development of a more modern approach to women's roles, these reforms were slow and limited. Women gained access to education in a way they never had before, but they were still largely confined to traditional roles within the home and family. The ideals of marriage, motherhood, and domesticity remained central to the Meiji conception of womanhood. Women who sought to break free from these traditional roles often faced resistance, both from society at large and from their families. The social pressures placed on women during the Meiji period were immense. While there were some avenues for women to gain independence through education or employment, these opportunities were rare and often came with the expectation of maintaining traditional virtues. Women were still seen primarily as mothers and wives, responsible for upholding the honor of their families and maintaining the stability of the household. The limited opportunities for women in the public sphere meant that many were forced to stay within the confines of their homes, their potential stifled by rigid societal expectations. The psychological effects of this confinement were profound, as many women, despite the opportunities for education, were still left without meaningful ways to participate in the new, modernized society. The emotional trauma of living through the transition from feudalism to a modern nation was felt by nearly every class in Japan. The emotional resilience of the people, shaped by centuries of hardship and subjugation, was tested as Japan rapidly industrialized and attempted to assimilate into the global order. For peasants, the samurai, and women, the psychological scars of the past remained. The alienation caused by industrialization, the loss of traditional roles, and the difficulty of navigating a new social order left many feeling adrift. The promise of the Meiji Restoration, a new, prosperous Japan, was for many an empty promise, one that masked the deep emotional wounds inflicted by centuries of feudal oppression. In many ways, the psychological impact of the Meiji period continued to shape Japan well into the 20th century. The trauma of rapid modernization, coupled with the emotional toll of the feudal system's dissolution, created a society in which many individuals struggled to find their place. The Meiji era, though a time of economic and political transformation, was also a time of deep personal upheaval, particularly for those who had lived through the oppression of feudal Japan. As Japan sought to modernize and move forward, it was clear that the emotional scars of its past would not be easily healed. As Japan entered the 20th century, the emotional and psychological consequences of the Meiji Restoration and its preceding feudal period continued to reverberate across society. The modernization that Japan experienced during the Meiji era, while transforming the nation into a global power, also left deep scars on the lower classes, former samurai and women. The rapid pace of change, coupled with the loss of traditional structures and identities, continued to shape the lives of individuals for generations. The shift from a feudal society to a modern industrial state was not just an economic or political transformation. It was a profound cultural and emotional upheaval that left many struggling to understand their place in the new world. For the peasants, the impact of the Meiji reforms was mixed at best. The promise of land redistribution and economic opportunity never fully materialized for the majority of the rural population. While some peasants did gain nominal ownership of the land they worked, the heavy tax burdens imposed by the government left many of them in the same cycle of poverty they had experienced under the samurai. The new economic system, which prioritized industrialization and the creation of a modern capitalist economy, often exacerbated the exploitation of rural workers rather than alleviating their struggles. The dislocation caused by industrialization and urbanization also continued to affect peasants. Many, in search of better opportunities, moved to cities where they faced overcrowded living conditions, long hours in factories, and dangerous working environments. The dream of a better life in the city was for many an illusion. As the peasants adapted to the factory system, they found themselves working under conditions that were just as grueling, if not more so, than their previous agrarian lives. The promise of upward mobility through industrialization was largely unattainable for the majority of the peasantry, who found themselves trapped in the same cycle of exploitation, but now in the context of a rapidly industrializing society. The psychological burden for peasants during this time was immense. The emotional toll of being displaced from their rural homes, working in factories far from their traditional villages, and facing harsh economic realities created a sense of alienation. Many peasants, who had once been connected to the land and their communities, now found themselves lost in urban environments where their sense of identity and purpose was eroded. The transition to factory work, though it promised economic opportunity, often resulted in the erosion of community bonds and a sense of collective identity. The rapid changes that took place during the Meiji period left the rural population feeling disconnected from their past and uncertain about their future. For the samurai, the emotional and psychological toll of losing their status was a continuing source of turmoil. The collapse of the feudal system had obliterated their once proud position as the ruling class of Japan. The loss of their lands, titles, and power left many samurai struggling to define themselves in a world that no longer had a place for them. The emotional trauma of this loss was compounded by the fact that the Meiji government's reforms forced samurai to abandon the traditional roles that had defined their lives for centuries. Some samurai found solace in the military or civil service, but for many, the transition to these new roles was fraught with personal and emotional conflict. The samurai were used to a world where their loyalty and honor defined their worth. But in the new modernized Japan, those values seemed obsolete. The Meiji government's push to westernize Japan and eliminate the samurai class left many away, them struggling with their identity and sense of purpose. The disappearance of the traditional warrior class was not just a political shift, it was a deeply emotional and psychological loss for the samurai, who had been trained to live and die by their code of honor. The former samurai who were unable to adapt to the new world often faced a deep sense of shame and disillusionment. Many turned to more radical forms of resistance, such as the Satsuma Rebellion, which was a last-ditch effort to restore the old order. The defeat of the rebellion was a final, bitter blow to the samurai, and the emotional toll of their loss was felt across the nation. The samurai, who had once been the embodiment of Japanese identity, were now relics of a bygone era. Their values, their honor, and their purpose seemed irrelevant in the face of Japan's rapid transformation into a modern industrial power. For women, the Meiji period represented both progress and continued oppression. The government's emphasis on women's education and participation in the workforce provided some women with new opportunities, but these reforms were limited. Despite being given access to education, women were still largely confined to roles within the home. The societal expectations surrounding marriage, motherhood, and domesticity were slow to change, and many women continued to be treated as second-class citizens. The Meiji government's reforms in education allowed women to gain knowledge and skills that had previously been unavailable to them, but the overarching social system still relegated them to subordinate roles. While some women gained new opportunities in the workforce, particularly in the fields of teaching and healthcare, their participation in public life remained restricted. The psychological toll of living in a world where women were valued primarily for their domestic abilities and their roles as wives and mothers was heavy. For many women, the Meiji period, despite its promises of modernity and progress, still left them feeling constrained by traditional gender roles. Women's efforts to push beyond the confines of these roles were often met with resistance. Many sought to break free from the societal expectations placed on them, pushing for more freedom in education, employment, and politics. But the pace of change was slow, and the societal pressure to conform remained a constant force in women's lives. The emotional burden of trying to navigate a world that still saw them as inferior to men left many women feeling frustrated, powerless, and disillusioned with the slow pace of change. As Japan entered the 20th century, the emotional and psychological legacy of feudalism, combined with the trauma of rapid modernization, continued to shape the lives of its people. The Meiji Restoration had brought significant political, social, and economic reforms, yet for many, particularly the peasants, samurai, and women, the transformation was incomplete. The promises of progress and equality were often at odds with the deep-seated realities of exploitation, alienation, and identity loss. These unresolved tensions would play a critical role in shaping Japan's future, especially as the country navigated its way through the early stages of modernity. The peasants, who had long been the backbone of Japanese society, continued to face immense hardships even after the Meiji period. While the Meiji government introduced land reforms, the heavy tax burdens, combined with the shift toward industrial capitalism, often left rural communities struggling. Peasants who had once worked the land in the traditional way found themselves caught between two worlds, the agrarian past and the industrial future. Many moved to urban areas in search of work, only to find themselves trapped in overcrowded, unhealthy conditions in factories. The psychological toll of this transition was profound. The sense of belonging to a close-knit rural community was replaced by the harsh reality of factory labor, where workers were treated as commodities. The loss of their agrarian way of life left many feeling dislocated and powerless, unable to connect with the fast-paced changes in society. The former samurai, too, faced emotional and psychological challenges as they adjusted to the new social order. Their loss of status and privilege in the wake of the Meiji Restoration marked a dramatic shift in their identities. Once the elite ruling class, they were now forced to reconcile with a new reality where their traditional values, defined by Bushido and loyalty to their lords, seemed irrelevant. Some samurai tried to adapt to new roles in the military or government, but many struggled with a sense of purposelessness. The Satsuma Rebellion, which represented a desperate attempt to restore the old order, was not just a political conflict. It was an expression of the profound psychological and emotional trauma felt by samurai who could not come to terms with their obsolescence. The loss of their societal role left many samurai adrift, unable to find meaning in a world that no longer valued their honor, discipline, and martial skill. Women, meanwhile, continued to struggle with the constraints of traditional gender roles despite the reforms of the Meiji period. While access to education and the workforce improved for women during this time, these opportunities were often limited and did not fundamentally change the expectations placed upon them. The societal emphasis on marriage, motherhood, and maintaining the family's honor remained dominant. For many women, the Meiji period represented a time of both promise and limitation, offering some new freedoms but still largely confining women to traditional domestic roles. The psychological burden of these constraints was significant. Women who sought to push beyond the boundaries of their prescribed roles often faced societal resistance, leaving them feeling frustrated, powerless, and excluded from the rapidly changing world of modern Japan. As Japan moved into the 20th century, the unresolved psychological wounds of the Meiji period would continue to shape the country's development. The shift from a feudal, agrarian society to a modern, industrialized nation created deep divisions between those who adapted to the new world and those who could not. The rapid pace of change, combined with the trauma of centuries of feudal oppression, left many feeling disconnected from their history and unsure of their place in the future. For the peasants, the samurai, and women, the promise of equality and opportunity in the Meiji era often rang hollow. The wounds of the past could not be healed overnight, and the journey toward modernity was marked by a constant struggle to reconcile old identities with new realities. In the years following the Meiji Restoration, Japan would continue to face the emotional and psychological consequences of its modernization efforts. The trauma of losing traditional social structures, the psychological scars of industrialization, and the lingering effects of feudal oppression would remain with Japan as it moved through the 20th century, facing new challenges, including militarism, war, and rebuilding after the devastation of World War II. The journey from feudalism to modernity was not just a political or economic transformation, it was a deeply personal and emotional one for the people of Japan. As the country continued to modernize, the people of Japan were forced to reckon with their past in ways that would shape the future. The loss of the samurai's traditional role, the dislocation of the peasantry, and the continued subjugation of women would remain important themes in Japan's cultural and social development. Despite the rapid advances of the Meiji period, Japan's path to full modernity would be fraught with emotional struggles as the people sought to reconcile the past with the present and forge a new identity in a rapidly changing world.